The parking lot was empty except for 2 cars and the flickering neon sign that cast purple shadows across the asphalt. Daniel Martinez sat in his Honda Civic, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see her silhouette in the diner window, still sitting in their usual booth, still waiting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He'd been sitting there for 23 minutes. 23 minutes of staring at that window, rehearsing the words he'd never been able to say, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The radio played some old song he didn't recognize, but the lyrics seemed written just for this moment. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. Daniel reached for the door handle 3 times. 3 times he pulled his hand back. This wasn't supposed to be so difficult. People ended relationships every day. People moved on. People said goodbye and meant it. But as he sat there in the dark, watching Rachel's reflection in the window, he realized that maybe the problem wasn't saying goodbye. Maybe the problem was that he'd never really wanted to leave at all. The story really began 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other Tuesday morning until it wasn't. Daniel was running late for his shift at Morrison and Associates, the mid-tier accounting firm where he'd been working for the past 3 years. Coffee in one hand, briefcase in the other. He burst through the glass doors of the downtown office building and collided directly into someone coming. Out of the elevator, coffee went everywhere. Papers scattered across the marble floor like confused birds. And there, kneeling in a puddle of Colombian dark roast, picking up what looked like resumes, was the most beautiful woman Daniel had ever seen outside of a movie screen. God, I'm so sorry, he stammered, dropping to his knees to help gather the soggy papers. I'm such an idiot. I was late and I wasn't looking, and hey, it's okay, she said, and when she looked up at him, Daniel forgot how to breathe properly. Her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, and when she smiled, something shifted in his chest. Really, it's fine. These were just extra copies anyway. Her name was Rachel Thompson, and she was interviewing for a position at the marketing firm on the 7th floor. Daniel worked on the 12th floor, but suddenly he found reasons to take the elevator to 7, at least twice a day. He'd walk past their reception area, pretending to be lost or looking for the bathroom, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. It took him 2 weeks to work up the courage to ask her out. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and practiced conversations in the mirror. 2 weeks of his coworkers teasing him about his obvious distraction and his friend Marcus, betting him $20 that he'd never actually do it. When he finally approached her in the building's coffee shop, his planned speech evaporated entirely. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she replied, looking up from her laptop. "I'm Daniel, from the elevator. The coffee disaster, I remember." She was smiling again, and Daniel felt that same chest-shifting sensation. "Rachel, I remember too. Your name, I mean?" He was stumbling over every word like a middle schooler. "I was wondering if maybe you'd like to get dinner sometime. It's with me. Obviously with me, since I'm the one asking, but I meant I'd love to," she said, and just like that, Daniel's world tilted on its axis. Their first date was at Angelo's, a little Italian place tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop on 5th Street. Daniel had chosen it because it seemed romantic but not too fancy, the kind of place where conversation could flow naturally. He'd even made a reservation, something he'd never done in his 28 years of life. Rachel arrived wearing a blue dress that made her eyes look even more golden. And Daniel spent the first 10 minutes of dinner wondering how he'd gotten so lucky. She was funny and smart and had opinions about everything from local politics to the best pizza toppings. She laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. And when she talked about her work in marketing, her whole face lit up with passion. "I love the psychology of it," she explained, twirling pasta around her fork. "Understanding what makes people connect with a brand, what makes them feel something. It's like solving puzzles, but the pieces are human emotions." Daniel found himself leaning forward, genuinely fascinated. His own job felt mundane by comparisonless spreadsheets and tax forms and quarterly reports that no one outside the office would ever care about. But listening to Rachel talk about campaigns and consumer behavior and the art of storytelling and advertising made him realize how narrow his world had become. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you like accounting?" It was such a simple question, but Daniel found himself pausing longer than he should have. Did he like accounting? He was good at it, certainly. Numbers made sense to him in a way that people often didn't. There was comfort in the predictability of it, the way everything had to balance out in the end. "It's stable," he said finally. "Secure. Good benefits." Rachel tilted her head slightly, studying him. "That's not what I asked." And there it was, the first crack in the foundation of everything Daniel thought he knew about himself. Because the truth was, he couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about whether he actually liked his job. He'd chosen accounting because it was practical, because his father had been an accountant, because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. But like it, enjoy it. Those weren't questions he'd ever allowed himself to ask. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty surprised him. "I don't think I've ever really thought about it that way." Rachel reached across the table and touched his hand. "Maybe you should." They walked back to her apartment building after dinner, taking the long route through Riverside Park, even though it was October and the wind was sharp. They talked about everything and nothing. Childhood pets, favorite movies, the weird habits of their coworkers. Daniel learned that Rachel had grown up in Oregon, that she'd wanted to be a veterinarian until she realized she couldn't handle putting animals to sleep, that she collected vintage postcards from places she'd never been. "What's your biggest dream?" she asked as they paused by the fountain in the center of the park. Daniel opened his mouth to give some safe, generic answer, but found himself saying, "I used to want to be a writer. Used to. Still do, I guess. But it's not practical. People don't make a living as writers. Some people do, but not people like me." "What's people do you like?" He struggled to put it into words. "Ordinary people. People who need steady paychecks and health insurance and retirement plans." Rachel was quiet for a moment, watching the water cascade down the fountain's tears. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think ordinary people are the ones with the most extraordinary stories to tell. They just haven't given themselves permission to tell them yet." Standing there in the park, with the streetlights casting long shadows and Rachel's words hanging in the air between them, Daniel felt something crack, open inside his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the possibility of love. It's the promise of becoming someone different, someone braver, someone who might actually deserve the way she was looking at him. He walked her to her door, and when she stood on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek goodnight, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that his life had just been divided into two parts, before Rachel and everything that would come after. The next few months passed in a blur of dinners and weekend trips and late night phone calls that stretched until dawn. Daniel had never been in a relationship that felt so easy, so natural. With Rachel, he could talk about things he'd never shared with anyone, his secret attempts at writing short stories, his complicated relationship with his father, his fear that he was sleepwalking through his own life. Rachel had a way of seeing possibilities where Daniel saw only obstacles. When he mentioned his stories, she insisted on reading them. When he complained about a particularly difficult client at work, she helped him see the situation from a completely different angle. When he expressed doubts about anything, his career, his choices, his worth challenged him with questions that made him think deeper about who he really was and who he wanted to become. "You're different when you talk about writing," she told him one evening as they sat on her couch, Chinese takeout containers scattered across the coffee table. "Your whole face changes. You get this energy, this excitement. I don't see that when you talk about work." Daniel set down his chopsticks. "Writing doesn't pay the bills, but what if it could?" "Rachel, come on, be realistic." "I am being realistic." "You're talented, Daniel. Really talented. You're miserable at Morrison and Associates. I can see it in your eyes every time you come home from work. Home." She'd said it so casually, but the word hit Daniel like a physical force when had her. "Apartment become home?" When had their separate lives become so intertwined that she could read his moods like a weather report? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even if I wanted to try, he said carefully, I couldn't just quit my job. I have responsibilities. A lease? Student loans? I'm not saying quit tomorrow. I'm saying maybe start thinking about it. Maybe start taking your writing seriously. Maybe stop using practicality as an excuse to avoid taking risks. It was the first time they'd really argued, though it didn't feel like arguing. It felt like Rachel was trying to pull him toward something while he dug his heels into the ground, determined to stay exactly where he was. Some of us can't afford to chase dreams, he said, and immediately regretted the sharpness in his voice. Rachel's expression shifted, and Daniel realized he'd hit a nerve. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. I just mean no. Say what you mean, Daniel. He looked around her apartment, the exposed brick walls, the hardwood floors, the vintage furniture, that somehow managed to look both comfortable and expensive. Rachel worked at a small marketing firm, but she lived in a neighborhood where Daniel couldn't afford even a studio apartment. It's easy to tell someone to follow their dreams when you don't have to worry about money, he said quietly. The silence that followed was the kind that feels heavy and breakable at the same time. Rachel stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel watched something close off in her expression. You think I don't worry about money? She asked finally. I think you have options I don't have. What options, Daniel? What exactly do you think? You know about my life? He realized he'd made a terrible mistake, but he was too deep in it now to back down gracefully. I know you live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Arts District. I know you drive a car that's newer than mine. I know you talk about taking risks like they don't have consequences. Rachel stood up slowly, and Daniel could see her hands shaking slightly. You know what you see on the surface? You don't know that I work 60 hours a week to afford this place. You don't know that I haven't bought new clothes in 8 months. You don't know that the car belongs to my roommate who moved out last month and stuck me with double rent. Rachel, I didn't. You don't. Know that I encourage you to follow your dreams because I believe in you, not because I think it's easy. And you definitely don't know that I've been falling in love with someone who apparently thinks I'm some spoiled princess who doesn't understand how the real world works. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Falling in love. She'd said it in anger, but she'd said it. And Daniel realized that he'd been falling too, so gradually that he hadn't noticed until this moment, when the possibility of losing her made his chest feel like it was caving in. I'm sorry, he said, but Rachel was already walking toward the door. I think you should go, she said, without turning around. Daniel stood there for a moment. Takeout containers still scattered around him, trying to figure out how they'd gotten from discussing his writing to this, how he'd managed to take Rachel's support and turn it into an accusation, how he'd let his own insecurities poison the best thing that had ever happened to him. Rachel, please, let me explain. She opened the door and stood beside it, still not looking at him. I said, I think you should go. Daniel, being Daniel, did exactly what he always did when things got complicated. He left, but as he stood in the hallway outside her apartment, listening to the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, he realized that leaving had never felt so much like the wrong choice. For the first time in his life, running away felt like the coward's option rather than the safe one. He spent the next 3 days replaying the conversation, analyzing every word like it was a tax return that wouldn't balance. He wrote her emails he never sent, practiced apologies in his bathroom mirror, and called her number 17 times without ever hitting send. On Thursday, he finally worked up the courage to go to her office building. He waited in the lobby for 2 hours, but she never appeared. On Friday, he tried again, this time with flowers and a handwritten letter that had taken him for drafts to get right. The security guard at the front desk looked at him with something that might have been pity. She called down this morning, said she wasn't expecting any deliveries. Daniel walked back to his car with the flowers still in his hand. Understanding for the first time what it meant to have your heart actually physically ache, the letter sat on his passenger seat for the entire drive home. All those carefully chosen words suddenly feeling inadequate. Saturday morning, he found himself at Angelo's, sitting in the same booth where they'd had their first date. The waitress, who'd served them that night, recognized him and asked where his girlfriend was. Daniel ordered coffee and sat there for 3 hours, staring at the empty seat across from him, wondering how he'd managed to destroy the best relationship of his. Life over something so stupid? That's when Marcus found him. "You look like hell," his friend said, sliding into Rachel's seat without invitation.
Thanks.
"That's exactly what I needed to hear. Sarah told me what happened." Well, she told me her version of what happened, which I'm assuming isn't complete. Sarah was Marcus's girlfriend, and she worked in the same building as Rachel. Daniel had been dreading this conversation, knowing it was inevitable. "She thinks I'm an asshole," Daniel said. "Are you?" "Probably." Marcus signaled the waitress for coffee. "You want to tell me what actually happened? Or should I just go with Sarah's version where you accused Rachel of being a trust fund baby who doesn't understand real life?" Daniel winced. "It wasn't exactly like that, but close enough." Close enough. They sat in silence for a moment while Marcus stirred sugar into his coffee. Finally, he looked up at Daniel with the expression he usually reserved for particularly difficult conversations. "You know what your problem is? I'm sure you're going to tell me. Your problem is that you're so afraid of getting hurt that you hurt other people first. You've been doing it since college. Hell, probably since high school." Daniel wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words, because Marcus wasn't wrong. Every relationship Daniel had ever been in had ended the same way, with him finding reasons to leave before the other person could leave him. But this time felt different. This time he didn't want to leave. "She was trying to help me," he said quietly. "I know. She believes in me more than I believe in myself. I know that too. So why did I? Because you're scared. When you get scared, you get mean. It's not attractive, but it's predictable." Daniel looked around the restaurant, at the couples sharing meals and the families laughing together. It felt like he was watching life through a window instead of actually living it. "I think I love her," he said. "I know you do. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and tried to write down everything he wanted to say to Rachel. The apology came easy. He knew he'd been wrong, knew he'd let his insecurities turn her support into an attack. But beyond the apology, he struggled to find words for the bigger truth, that Rachel had seen something in him that he'd never seen in himself. And instead of being grateful, he'd been terrified. He wrote until his hand cramped, crossing out lines and starting over, trying to capture the way she made him feel like he could be someone different, someone braver, someone worthy of the way. She looked at him when he talked about the stories he wanted to tell. By Sunday morning, he had 17 pages of handwritten text that somehow still didn't feel like enough. But it was a start. And for the first time in 4 days, Daniel felt like maybe there was a way forward that didn't involve him spending the rest of his life regretting the best thing that had ever happened to him. He folded the letter carefully, put on his best shirt, and drove to Rachel's apartment building. This time, he wasn't going to let fear make the decision for him. This time, he was going to fight for what mattered, even if it meant risking everything. Especially if it meant risking everything. The building's lobby was different on Sunday morning, quieter, emptier, with that weekend stillness that made every footstep echo. Daniel stood at the elevator bank, 17 pages of handwritten confession folded in his jacket pocket. Watching the numbers climb toward the 7th floor where Rachel's apartment waited, he'd rehearsed his speech during the entire drive over, but now, standing in the hallway outside her door, every word he'd planned evaporated. The carpet beneath his feet was burgundy with small gold fleurs de lis, and he found himself counting them while he worked up the courage to knock 23 fleurs de lis between the elevator and her door. He'd counted them 3 times when he finally raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles made contact. Rachel stood there in pajama pants and an oversized Northwestern sweatshirt. Her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like she hadn't slept much either, and Daniel felt a flicker of hope that maybe she'd been thinking about him too. "I saw you from the window," she said. "You've been standing out here for 10 minutes. I was working up the courage. To knock on a door? To face you after what I said?" Rachel stepped back, and for a moment Daniel thought she was going to invite him in. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, creating a barrier between them. "To talk," she said. Daniel pulled the letter from his pocket, but the words he'd written suddenly seemed inadequate. How could 17 pages of explanation capture the way his stomach had twisted every day since she'd told him to leave? How could he make her understand that he'd been running from her not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much? "Wrote you a letter," he said, holding it out to her. Rachel looked at the folded pages but didn't take them. "I don't want to read your letter, Daniel. I want you to tell me what you're thinking right now. No script, no preparation, just honesty." Hallway felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were pressing in around them. Daniel could hear someone playing piano in one of the other apartments, a melancholy melody that seemed to underscore the weight of the moment. "I was scared," he said finally. "Of what?" "Of you, of how you made me feel, of the person I could become, if I let myself believe what you were saying about me." Rachel's expression softened slightly, but she didn't move from the doorframe. "What person is that?" "Someone who takes risks. Someone who goes after what he wants instead of settling for." "What's safe?" "Someone who might actually be worth loving." "And that terrifies you?" Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything about you terrifies me, Rachel. The way you see possibilities where I see obstacles. The way you make me want to be better than I am. The way you look at me like I'm already the person I want to become, so you decided to push me away instead. I decided to prove you wrong before you could figure it out yourself." The piano music stopped, leaving them in silence. Rachel studied his face for a long moment, and Daniel felt like she was reading every insecurity he'd ever tried to hide. "Know what the worst part is?" she said finally. "What? I wasn't wrong about you. I'm still not wrong about you. You'd rather be miserable and safe than happy and uncertain." Daniel wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. She was right. He'd spent his entire adult life choosing security over satisfaction, predictability over passion. He'd convinced himself that wanting more was selfish, that dreams were luxuries he couldn't afford. "I don't know how to be any different," he admitted. "Yes. You do, you just don't want to try. That's not fair, isn't it?" Rachel stepped forward, and Daniel caught the scent of her shampoo, that citrus smell that had become synonymous with comfort in his mind. "You had me, Daniel, yet someone who believed in you, who supported you, who was falling in love with you. You threw it away because taking a chance on yourself felt too risky." "I didn't throw it away. I made one mistake. It wasn't one mistake. It was a choice. You chose to see me as the enemy instead of your partner. You chose to assume the worst about my intentions instead of trusting what I was telling you. You chose to protect yourself instead of protecting us." Each word hit Daniel like a physical blow, partly because of the pain in Rachel's voice, but mostly because every accusation was true. He had made choices, had actively decided to sabotage what they had together rather than risk being vulnerable. "You're right," he said, "about all of it. I chose wrong. So what are you doing here, Daniel? What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and consequence. Daniel realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward, not just the past week, but maybe his entire life. Every safe choice, every path of least resistance, every time he'd chosen comfort over courage had led him to this hallway, to this question, to this chance to finally be honest about what he wanted. "I want to choose differently," he said. "I want to choose you. I want to choose us. And then what? What happens when the next scary thing comes along, when the next opportunity to run presents itself?" Daniel looked down at the letter still clutched in his hand, then back at Rachel's face. "I don't know. I wish I could promise you that I'll be brave from now on, but I can't. I'm probably going to be scared again. I'm probably going to want to run again. That's not exactly a compelling argument. But I'm here now. I'm scared as hell, but I'm here. And maybe that's enough to start with." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could see her weighing his words, trying to decide if they were enough. Finally, she stepped back from the doorframe. "Come in," she said. Daniel followed her into the apartment, noting the changes since he'd been there last. The takeout containers were gone, replaced by a half-finished jigsaw puzzle spread across the coffee table. The couch cushions were arranged differently, and there were fresh flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter. "Coffee?" Rachel asked, already moving toward the kitchen. Please. She busied herself with the coffee maker while Daniel stood awkwardly in the living room, unsure whether he should sit or remain standing. Whether this invitation meant forgiveness or just a willingness to hear him out. You can sit, Rachel said, without turning around. I'm not going to throw you out. Daniel settled onto the couch, careful not to disturb the puzzle. It was a landscape scene, mountains reflected in a still lake, the kind of image that looked peaceful but was probably maddening to put together. How's the puzzle coming? He asked. Slowly, I started it after you left. Seemed like a good metaphor for trying to put pieces back together. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence. Rachel returned with 2 mugs, handing one to Daniel before settling into the armchair across from him rather than on the couch beside him. The distance felt intentional. So, she said, talk to me about choosing differently. Daniel wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to do with his nervous energy. I've been thinking about what you said. About me using practicality as an excuse to avoid taking risks. And I think you were right. I think I've been hiding behind responsibility and stability because they felt safer than admitting what I actually want, which is to write. To take my story seriously. To see if I could actually make something of myself as a writer. Rachel's expression remained neutral, but Daniel caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Interest, maybe. Or hope. What would that look like, she asked. I don't know yet. Maybe freelance writing to start. Maybe trying to get some pieces published. Maybe eventually leaving Morrison and Associates if I could build up enough income. That's a big maybe. It's a start. Rachel sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of her mug. What changed your mind? Daniel set his coffee down and leaned forward. Losing you? Realizing that the safe choice isn't always the right choice? Understanding that some things are worth the risk? Some things? You, this, whatever we could be together if I stopped being so afraid of it. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could see her processing his words, trying to decide if they were enough. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been in the hallway. I was falling in love with you, she said. Past tense. I was falling in love with the person you could be, but also with the person you already were. The one who showed up at my door with flowers after our first date. The one who listened to me talk about work like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. The one who told me stories about the characters in his head like they were real people. I'm still that person. Are you? Because the person who accused me of not understanding the real world, who assumed I was some privileged princess who'd never had to worry about money, I don't know that person. That person felt like a stranger. Daniel flinched at the memory. I was defensive. I was scared that you were seeing things in me that weren't really there, and I lashed out. Why? Why couldn't you just trust what I was telling you? It was the question Daniel had been asking himself for days, and he still wasn't sure he had a complete answer. Because I've never been the kind of person that someone like you falls in love with. Someone like me. Smart, ambitious, beautiful. Someone who sees the world as full of possibilities instead of obstacles. Rachel set down her mug and moved to the window, looking out at the street below. You know what's funny? I was intimidated by you too. By me? By how grounded you were, how responsible. How you seemed to have your life figured out while I was still figuring out what I wanted to do with mine. Daniel joined her at the window, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I don't have anything figured out. I know that now. But at the time, it felt like you had something I was missing. Stability, security, a plan. Those aren't necessarily good things. They're not necessarily bad things either. The problem wasn't that you were practical, Daniel. The problem was that you used your practicality as a weapon against me when I tried to encourage you to take a chance on yourself. They stood in silence, watching the street below where a jogger was making his way past the building, headphones in, focused on the path ahead. Daniel wondered what it would feel like to have that kind of singular focus, to know exactly where you were going and how to get there. I miss you, he said quietly. I miss you too. But missing someone isn't enough to fix what went wrong between us. What would be enough? Rachel turned to face him, and Daniel could see the struggle in her expression, the part of her that wanted to forgive him fighting, against the part that was afraid of being hurt again. I need to know that you're willing. To work on yourself. Not just for me, but for you. I need to know that you're serious about making changes, not just talking about them. What kind of changes? Start with your writing. You said you want to take it seriously? Prove it. Write something. Submit it somewhere. Take a risk on yourself. Daniel felt his stomach clench. What if I'm not good enough? What if you are? If I fail, what if you succeed? It was the same conversation they'd had months ago, but from a different angle. This time, instead of feeling like Rachel was pushing him toward something he didn't want, Daniel could see that she was offering him something he'd been afraid to want. Okay, he said. Okay, what? Okay, I'll do it. I'll write something and submit it somewhere. I'll take a risk on myself. Rachel smiled, and Daniel felt that familiar chest-shifting sensation, like pieces of himself were falling back into place. There's something else, she said. What? I need to know that you're not going to run the next time things get difficult. I need to know that you're willing to fight for us instead of against us. Daniel reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't. Pull away. I can't promise I won't get scared again, but I can promise that I'll try to talk to you about it instead of just assuming the worst. That's a start. Is it enough? Rachel squeezed his hand. It's enough for now. They spent the rest of the afternoon on her couch working on the puzzle. Together, while they talked about the week they'd spent apart, Daniel learned that Rachel had cried for 3 days straight, that she'd almost called him a dozen times, that she'd been as miserable as he had been. I kept thinking about what you said, she admitted as they searched for pieces of the mountain's reflection, about me not understanding money problems. And I realized that maybe I hadn't been as open about my own struggles as I should have. Ben, you don't owe me your financial history. Maybe not. But if we're going to try this again, I want you to know who I really am, not the version of me you've constructed in your head. Over the next hour, Rachel told him about her student loans, her credit card debt, the second job she'd taken to afford her apartment. She told him about growing up in a single-parent household, about her mother working 3 jobs to keep them, afloat, about the scholarship that had made college possible. I push you to take risks because I know what it's like to play it safe out of necessity, she said.
Out.
But I also know what it's like to have opportunities and be too afraid to take them. I don't want you to look back in 10 years and wonder what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to try. Daniel felt something shift inside him, a recognition that he'd been so focused on protecting himself that he'd never really seen Rachel clearly. He'd created a version of her that fit his insecurities rather than accepting the complex, vulnerable person she actually was. I'm sorry, he said, for making assumptions, for not seeing you. I'm sorry, too, for pushing too hard, for not understanding that your caution comes from a real place. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the puzzle pieces, Daniel realized that maybe this was what love actually looked like, not the fairy tale version he'd been afraid of, but the messier, more complicated reality of 2 people choosing to see each other clearly and deciding to try anyway. So what happens now? He asked. Rachel fitted a piece of sky into place, completing a small section of the mountain. Scene, now we see if we can put the pieces back together. Oh. And if we can't, then at least we'll know we tried. Daniel looked at the puzzle spread across the table, hundreds of pieces that would eventually form a complete picture if they were patient enough, careful enough, willing enough to keep trying, even when the pieces didn't seem to fit. I love you, he said. Rachel looked up from the puzzle, and for the first time in a week, she smiled at him without reservation. Or with why did I done one like well I way right away
when I would write,
It wasn't a promise that everything would be easy from now on. It wasn't a guarantee that they wouldn't face more challenges, more moments of doubt, more opportunities to run or stay and fight, but it was a beginning, choice to try again, to build something together, one piece at a time. And for Daniel, who had spent his entire life choosing safety over possibility, it felt like the bravest thing he'd ever done. 3 weeks later, Daniel sat at his laptop in the corner booth of Caf Luna, staring at a blank document that mocked him with its cursor blinking like an impatient heartbeat. The coffee shop hummed. With the usual Monday morning energy, students hunched over textbooks, freelancers claiming tables for the day, the gentle chaos of espresso machines and muffled conversations. He'd promised Rachel he would write something, submit it somewhere, take that leap of faith he'd been avoiding for years. But every time he tried to start, the words tangled in his throat like they were afraid of being written down. His phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "How's the writing going?" Daniel typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on. "Still working on it." Her reply came immediately. "You've got this." The faith in those 3 words should have been encouraging. But instead it made Daniel's chest tight with the weight of potential disappointment. What if he didn't have this? What if the stories in his head were only good enough for late-night daydreams and never meant to see actual paper? His laptop chimed with an email notification. Morrison and Associates. Quarterly reports were due by the end of the week. The familiar pull of responsibility tugged at him, offering the comfort of tasks he knew he could complete. Spreadsheets that would balance. Numbers that would add up correctly. Daniel closed the email without reading it and forced his fingers. Back to the keyboard, the first time Sarah Chen realized she could read people's memories. She was standing in line at the grocery store behind a man who smelled like cigarettes and regret. He stopped, read the sentence, deleted it. Try it again. Detective Morrison had seen enough crime scenes to know that the truth was usually uglier than anyone wanted to admit. But the body in the warehouse was telling a story that didn't make sense. Delete. When the last tree in Manhattan died, Maya Torres was the only one who noticed. This time he didn't delete it. The sentence sat there on the screen, imperfect but real, and Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. He kept typing. By the time he looked up, 2 hours had passed, and he had 800 words of what might actually be a story. Not a good story necessarily, but a story with a beginning and characters who wanted something and obstacles in their way. His phone rang. Marcus. "Please tell me you're not at the office," his friend said without preamble. "I'm not at the office." "Good. Because I have news, and you need to be sitting down for this." Daniel looked around the cafe. "I'm sitting. Johnson quit." Marcus worked at a digital marketing agency downtown, the kind of place Daniel had always imagined Rachel would end up eventually. "Okay." Johnson was our head writer, and left for a position at some startup in Seattle. "My boss is scrambling to find someone to finish his projects and take on new ones." Daniel felt a flicker of something that might have been intuition. "Why are you telling me this?" "It's because I may have mentioned that I know someone who's been looking to break into freelance writing. Someone talented who just needs an opportunity." "Marcus, it's not permanent, it's project-based. 3 articles for a client's website, maybe some social media copy. Pays better than your accounting gig, and it's exactly the kind of thing that could lead to bigger opportunities." Daniel stared at his laptop screen, at the story he'd been struggling to write, at the cursor blinking patiently at the end of an unfinished sentence. "I don't have any experience with marketing copy. You have experience writing? You understand how to communicate ideas clearly? That's 90% of the job. What's the other 10%? Showing up and not being completely terrible?" Daniel laughed despite himself. "That's a low bar. It's a realistic bar. Look, I already told my boss about you. She wants to see some writing samples by Thursday. I don't have writing samples. Then you better finish whatever you're working on and write something else." This is what opportunity looks like, Daniel. It's messy and inconvenient and terrifying, but it's real. After Marcus hung up, Daniel sat staring at his phone for several minutes. 3 days to put together a portfolio that could change the direction of his life. 3 days to prove that Rachel had been right about him, that he was capable of more than quarterly reports and tax returns. He called in sick too. Morrison and Associates. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of coffee and cramped fingers. And the strange exhilaration of creating something from nothing. Daniel finished the story about Maya Torres and the last tree. Then wrote to more one about a woman who collected other people's forgotten dreams. Another about a man who discovered that his reflection had been living a different life. The marketing samples. He crafted articles about sustainable urban planning, the psychology of consumer behavior, and the future of remote work. He researched target audiences and brand voices, learned about SEO and conversion rates. Discovered that writing for businesses wasn't so different from storytelling. It was still about understanding what people wanted and finding ways to give it to them. By Thursday morning, he had a portfolio that felt both amateur and promising. It's like a rough draft of who he might become. He sent the files to Marcus, then immediately wanted to recall them, convinced he'd made a terrible mistake. Rachel found him at Caf Luna that afternoon, pacing between the counter and the window while his laptop sat abandoned at his usual table. "Look like you're about to jump out of your skin," she said. "I submitted writing samples for a freelance job." Marcus set it up. "I'll probably hear back by 5 o'clock. "That's amazing, Daniel. Why do you look terrified? Because what if they hate everything I wrote? What if I'm deluding myself about being able to do this?" Rachel guided him back to his table, settling into the seat across from him. "What if they love what you wrote? That might be worse." "Why?" Daniel struggled to articulate the feeling. "Because then I'd have to actually do it. I'd have to be the person who takes risks and goes after what he wants. I'd have to live up to the faith you have in me. You know, that's not how faith works, right? I don't have faith in some theoretical version of you. I have faith in who you are right now, sitting here terrified, but still trying." Before Daniel could respond, his phone rang. "Unknown number." "Answer it," Rachel said. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he accepted the call. "Hello?" "Hi, is this Daniel Martinez? This is Jennifer Walsh from Catalyst Marketing." "Marcus Hernandez gave me your contact." "Information? Yes, that's me. I reviewed your writing samples, and I have to say, I'm impressed. Your voice is exactly what we're looking for, intelligent but accessible, engaging without being overly casual. I'd like to offer you the project we discussed." Daniel felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. "You would? Absolutely. The timeline is tight. We need the first article by Monday, but the pay is $1,500 for all 3 pieces, with potential for additional work if this goes well. $1,500, more than Daniel made in a week at Morrison and Associates. I accept." He heard himself say excellent. "I'll email you the project details this afternoon. And Daniel, welcome to the team." When he hung up, Rachel was smiling at him like he'd just won the lottery. "I got the job," he said, still not quite believing it. "You got the job? They want to pay me $1,500 to write 3 articles. They want to pay you to do what you love." Daniel looked around the cafe at the students and freelancers who had seemed so foreign to him just a few hours ago. No, he was one of them, someone who made a living with words, someone who had taken a chance and discovered it wasn't the end of the world. "I need to call Morrison and Associates," he said. "Tell them I won't be in tomorrow. Just tomorrow?" Daniel met Rachel's eyes across the table. It's maybe longer than that. That evening, they celebrated at Angelo's, the same restaurant where they'd had their first date. But this time, the conversation flowed differently. Instead of Daniel deflecting questions about his dreams, he found himself talking about ideas. For future articles, potential clients he could approach, and the possibility of building something sustainable. "You're different," Rachel observed as they shared tiramisu. "Different how? Lighter? Like you've been carrying something heavy and finally set it down?" Daniel considered this. "I think I've been carrying something heavy. The weight of all. The things I was afraid to try. And now I'm still afraid, but I'm more afraid of not trying." Rachel reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm proud of you." "For what?" "I haven't done anything yet." "You took the leap, chose uncertainty. Over safety? That's everything. Walking back to Rachel's apartment, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. Not the resigned acceptance of predictable days stretching ahead, but genuine anticipation of what might be possible. "Something to tell you," Rachel said as they paused outside her building. Daniel felt his stomach clench. "What?" "I got offered a promotion at work, senior marketing director. It comes with a significant pay raise and more responsibility. It's wonderful." "Why do you look nervous about it?" Rachel bit her lip. A gesture Daniel had learned meant she was working up the courage to say something difficult. "Because the position is in Chicago. They want me to relocate by the end of next month." The words hit Daniel like cold water. When everything was falling into place, just when he'd finally found the courage to build something with Rachel, the universe was asking them to navigate yet another obstacle. "Chicago," he repeated. "It's a 3-hour drive. Not impossible, but it's not easy either." They stood in silence for a moment, watching late-night pedestrians hurry past. Daniel felt the familiar urge to retreat, to declare this proof that taking risks only led to more complications. But instead of pulling away, he found himself stepping closer to Rachel. "When do you have to decide?" "Already decided. I'm taking it." Daniel felt his heart sink, then immediately felt ashamed of his selfishness. This was Rachel's dream job, the kind of opportunity she'd been working toward for years. "Of course you should take it. It's exactly what you deserve. I was hoping you might come with me." The suggestion hung in the air between them. It's enormous and terrifying and full of possibility. Chicago, a new city, a new start, a chance to build something together away from all the familiar patterns that had trapped them before. "I just got my first freelance job," Daniel said. "Freelance writing can be done anywhere. It's the beauty of it. But my apartment, my lease, are those things more important than this? Than us?" It was the same question Rachel had been asking him in different forms since they'd met, whether he was willing to choose love over security, possibility over predictability, the unknown over the familiar. Daniel looked up at Rachel's apartment, building at the windows, glowing warmly in the darkness, and realized that none of those rooms held what mattered most to him. What mattered was standing right in front of him, offering him a chance to finally become the person he'd always been afraid to be. "When do we leave?" he asked. Rachel's smile was radiant. We, if you'll have me. I've been waiting for you." "To catch up?" As they kissed on the sidewalk, Daniel felt something shift permanently inside him. For the first time in his life, the future felt like an adventure rather than a burden. A story worth writing rather than a sentence to be endured. And he couldn't wait to see how it would end. The U-Haul truck looked smaller than Daniel had expected for containing his entire life. He stood in the parking lot of his apartment complex, watching the movers load the last of his furniture, and marveled at how little space 28 years of existence actually required. A couch, a desk, 3 boxes of books, and a coffee table that had belonged to his grandmother. Everything else was either sold, donated, or deemed unworthy of the journey to Chicago. "Having second thoughts?" Marcus asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street. "Third and fourth thoughts," Daniel admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Maybe 5th thoughts. That's normal." "You're allowed to be terrified." "Am I allowed to throw up in the U-Haul?" "Please don't. I have to help you drive that thing." Marcus had volunteered to follow them to Chicago in his own car, claiming he wanted to see the Windy City, but really wanting to provide moral support for Daniel's latest act of courage. Rachel was inside the apartment, doing a final walkthrough, with the landlord handling the practical details that Daniel's nervous energy made impossible. "You know what's weird?" Danya said, watching a stranger carry his bookshelf toward the truck. "I thought leaving would feel more dramatic. It's like there should be orchestral music or something. Real life doesn't come with a soundtrack. Maybe it should." A text buzzed on Daniel's phone. "Jennifer Walsh from Catalyst Marketing. The Chicago client loved your work. They want to discuss a long-term contract. Can you meet next Tuesday?" Daniel showed Marcus the message. Apparently the universe has a sense of timing, or maybe you're just good at what you do. Let's not get crazy. Rachel emerged from the building, keys dangling from her finger, looking both excited and exhausted. She'd been handling the logistics of two people relocating while managing the transition at her current job. And Daniel had watched her transform into a general commanding a small army of moving companies, utility providers, and lease agreements. "All clear," she announced. "The security deposit will be mailed within 10 business days, and the super promises to forward any mail that shows up." "That's it then," Daniel said. "No turning back." "There was never any turning back," Rachel replied, but her smile was gentle. "Ready?" Daniel looked around the parking lot one more time. He'd lived in this building for 4 years, had developed routines and familiar patterns that felt like the architecture of his identity. The corner grocery store where Mrs. Kim always asked about his weekend plans. The bus stop where he'd waited every morning, watching the same commuters hurry toward the same destinations. The life he'd built carefully, safely, predictably. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." The drive to Chicago took 6 hours, 2 stops for gas, and 1 extended break at a roadside diner where Daniel consumed enough caffeine to power a small city. Rachel navigated while he drove, calling out directions and pointing out landmarks, her excitement building with each mile marker that brought them closer to their new life. "Tell me about the apartment again," Daniel said as they crossed into Illinois. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, walking distance to the L. The second bedroom has great light for your writing space. "My writing space," Daniel repeated, testing how the words felt in his mouth. A month ago, he would have laughed at the idea of having a dedicated space for something so impractical. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The neighborhood is called Lincoln Park. Young professionals, lots of restaurants, farmers markets on weekends. "I think you'll love it. What if I don't?" Rachel reached over and squeezed his hand. "Then we'll figure it out together." The apartment was a 3rd-floor walk-up in a building. It looked like it had been constructed sometime in the 1920s and lovingly maintained ever since. High ceilings, original molding, windows that actually opened everything Daniel's previous apartment had lacked. The moving truck was already waiting when they arrived, and for the next 4 hours, Daniel's entire world was reduced to carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and trying to figure out where everything should go. By evening, they had achieved something that resembled functional living space. The couch faced the windows overlooking the tree-lined street. Daniel's desk occupied the smaller bedroom, positioned to catch the afternoon light. Rachel's more extensive furniture had been delivered the week before, and somehow everything fit together like they'd been planning this shared life for years instead of weeks. "Pizza," Rachel suggested, collapsing onto the couch. "Pizza," Daniel agreed, too exhausted to consider cooking. They ate directly from the delivery boxes. Sitting on the hardwood floor with their backs against the couch, watching the sun set behind the buildings across the street, the apartment smelled like cardboard and new beginnings. And Daniel felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't realized had been restless. "So," Rachel said, folding a piece of pepperoni pizza in half, "how does it feel to be at Chicago on?" "Ask me tomorrow when I'm not delirious from carrying furniture." "Fair enough." Daniel's phone rang. An unknown number with a Chicago area code? "Daniel Martinez?" "This is Rebecca Santos from Chicago Magazine. I got your contact information from Jennifer Walsh at Catalyst Marketing." Daniel straightened, suddenly wide awake. "Thank you. I'm wondering if you might be interested in freelancing for us. We have a piece about urban farming initiatives that needs a writer who can make complex topics accessible. Jennifer mentioned that's one of your strengths." Daniel looked around the apartment, at the boxes that still needed unpacking, at Rachel, who was watching him with growing excitement. "I'd be very interested." "Excellent. The pay is $2,000 for a 3,000-word feature, with potential for additional assignments if this works out well. Can you meet Monday morning to discuss the details?" When he hung up, Rachel was grinning at him like he'd just announced he'd won the lottery. "Chicago Magazine?" she asked. "Chicago Magazine? That's huge, Daniel. That's the kind of publication that leads to other publications." Daniel felt the familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with excitement. What if I mess it up? What if you don't? It was becoming their refrain, the question that had guided every major decision over the past month. What if you don't fail? What if you succeed? What if the thing you're most afraid of is actually the thing that saves you? That night, lying in their new bedroom with the sounds of an unfamiliar city filtering through the windows, Daniel found himself thinking about the version of himself who had existed just 6 months ago. The man who had been content with predictable days and modest ambitions, who had seen dreams as luxuries rather than necessities. That person felt like a character in a story he'd read long ago, familiar but fundamentally foreign. "Are you awake?" Rachel whispered in the darkness. "Yeah, what are you thinking about?" Daniel considered lying, offering some simple answer that wouldn't require explanation. Instead, he chose honesty. "I'm thinking about how scared I was to leave my job. How terrified I was to move here with you. How certain I was that taking risks would lead to disaster. And now, I'm still scared, but I'm more excited than scared. Does that make sense?" Rachel turned toward him, and even in the darkness, he could sense her smile. "Perfect sense. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. For something to go wrong that proves I was right to be cautious all those years. What if nothing goes wrong? And I guess I'll have to admit that you were right about me all along. I'm always right about the important stuff." Daniel laughed, pulling her closer, modest too. "One of my many charms." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the city settle into sleep around them. Daniel thought about the morning ahead, about the magazine meeting and the article he'd write, about the possibility of building something meaningful, with words and ideas, and the strange alchemy of turning thoughts into sentences that mattered to strangers. "Rachel, thank you. For what? For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. For pushing me to be braver than I thought I could be. For making me believe that wanting more wasn't selfish. You did the hard part." Just pointed out what was already there. Daniel thought about that, about the difference between potential and action, between having dreams and pursuing them. Maybe courage wasn't about not being afraid. Maybe it was about being afraid and showing up anyway. Trusting that the path would reveal itself as you walked it. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." Outside their window, Chicago hummed with the energy of 8 million people pursuing their own versions of more. Some would succeed, some would fail, most would land somewhere in between. But all of them were trying, all of them had decided that the risk of disappointment was worth the possibility of something better. Daniel closed his eyes and let himself imagine the life they might build here. Articles that mattered, stories that found their audience. A career built on words and ideas rather than obligation and security. A partnership with someone who saw possibilities where he saw obstacles, who challenged him to be better than he thought he could be. 6 months ago, that future would have seemed impossible. Tonight, it felt inevitable. And for the first time in his adult life, Daniel Martinez fell asleep, excited about tomorrow. 1 year later, Daniel sat in his car outside. The same diner where everything had begun, though he was 300 miles away from that original parking lot. The rain was coming down just as hard as it had that night, and the neon sign flickered with the same unreliable rhythm. But everything else was different. He wasn't gripping the steering wheel in panic. He wasn't rehearsing words he was afraid to say. He wasn't sitting in the dark, paralyzed by the weight of his own indecision. Instead, he was smiling. His phone buzzed with a text from his editor at Chicago Magazine. "The urban farming piece is getting picked up nationally. Great work." Another message, this one from a literary journal in Portland. "We'd love to publish The Last Tree in our spring issue." And finally, one from Rachel. "How did the meeting go?" Daniel looked through the rain-streaked windshield at the diner's warm glow and typed back. About to find out, he'd driven down from Chicago that morning for a meeting that could change everything again. Morrison and Associates, his old accounting firm, had reached out through Marcus with an unexpected proposition. They wanted to hire him as a freelance consultant, writing content for their website and client newsletters. The pay was substantial. The work was remote, and it would provide the kind of financial security that his magazine writing, while fulfilling, couldn't quite guarantee yet. It was exactly the kind of opportunity the old Daniel would have accepted without question. Steady income, prestigious client, the validation of his former employer wanting him back. But as he sat in the parking lot, Daniel realized he wasn't the same person who had fled this life a year ago. The diner's door chimed as he entered. and he spotted his contact immediately, Janet Morrison, the firm's managing partner, sitting in a corner booth with a laptop and a stack of papers. She looked exactly as Daniel remembered. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of professional competence that had once intimidated him into compliance. "Daniel," she said, standing to shake his hand. "You look well. Chicago suits you. Thank you for coming all this way." "Are you kidding? After the articles Marcus showed me, I should be thanking you for considering our offer." They ordered coffee and spent the first few minutes on pleasantries, how he was adjusting to Chicago, what Rachel was doing with her new position, the usual small talk that preceded serious business conversations. But Daniel found himself studying Janet's face, remembering how her approval had once felt essential to his sense of self-worth. "So," Janet said, opening her laptop, "let me show you what we have in mind." The proposal was comprehensive. A 6-month contract with option to extend, writing financial newsletters for their client base, creating web content that made complex tax concepts accessible to ordinary people. The kind of work Daniel knew he could do well, with compensation that would allow him to be more selective about his magazine assignments. "It's a generous offer," Daniel said when she finished. "You'd be working with familiar material, familiar people. And you wouldn't have to worry about chasing down new clients or dealing with the uncertainty of freelance life." There it was, the appeal to his old fears, the promise of predictability over possibility. A year ago, those words would have felt like a lifeline. Now they felt like a gentle trap. "Can I be honest with you, Janet?" "Of course." "A year ago, I would have said yes before you finished explaining the terms. The old me would have been grateful that you were offering me a way back to the safety I thought I needed." Janet's expression shifted slightly. "And now I realize that safety isn't what I was actually looking for. I was looking for a purpose. For work that meant something to me, not just work that paid the bills." "Writing about tax law can't mean something," Daniel smiled. "It can, to the right person. But I'm not that person anymore." Janet closed her laptop slowly, returning down a 6-figure contract to write magazine articles that might not even exist next month. "I'm choosing the work that makes me excited to get up in the morning over the work that makes me dread Monday. That's a luxury most people can't afford." "You're right. It is a luxury. But it's one I'm willing to work for instead of one I'm willing to sacrifice for." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Daniel's decision settling between them. He thought about calling Rachel, about sharing this moment with someone who would understand its significance. But first, he wanted to sit with it himself, to feel the full weight of choosing possibility over security once more. "You know," Janet said finally, "5 years ago, I would have thought you were making a mistake. And now I wonder if I'm the one who's been making mistakes." Daniel left the diner feeling lighter than he had in months. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in golden light. He called Rachel from the parking lot. "How did it go?" she answered. "I said no. How do you feel about that?" "Terrified and exhilarated and completely certain all at once." "Those are my favorite kinds of decisions." "Mine too, apparently." That evening, back in their Chicago apartment, Daniel sat at his desk in the room with the good light, working on a story about a man who learned to read the language of departures. It was fiction, but it felt true in the way that the best stories didn't, like he was discovering something. It's about himself in the process of creating something for others. Rachel appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of wine. "How's the writing?" "Going good. Really good, actually." She settled into the chair by the window, the one they'd bought specifically for moments like this, when one of them was working and the other wanted to be nearby without interrupting. "I have news," she said. "Good news or challenging news?" "Both, maybe. I got offered another promotion." Daniel saved his document and turned to face her fully. "Tell me, Regional Director." "It would mean overseeing the marketing departments for 5 cities across the Midwest." "That's incredible, Rachel. You deserve it. There's a catch. There always is. I'd have to travel constantly. 3 weeks out of every month, minimum. And the headquarters would be in Kansas City." Daniel felt the familiar flutter of change approaching, but this time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like another adventure. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Want to take it? But only if you're okay with Kansas City. Will there be barbecue? The best in the country, supposedly?" "Then I'm in," Rachel laughed. "Just like that. Todd. My work is portable, and my life is wherever you are. You've really changed. You know that?" Daniel thought about the man who had sat in the same chair a year ago, agonizing over whether to submit his first freelance samples. The man who had been afraid to want more, afraid to risk what he had for what he might have. "Both changed," he said. "We're not the same people who met in that elevator. No, we're not. We're better." Later that night, as they lay in bed making plans for another move, another leap into uncertainty, Daniel found himself thinking about that moment in the parking lot when he'd been afraid to go into the diner and afraid to drive away, when staying and leaving had both seemed impossible. He understood now that the question was never really about staying or going. It was about whether he was willing to choose love over fear, growth over comfort, the unknown over the familiar, whether he was brave enough to trust that the path would reveal itself as he walked it. "Rachel," he said into the darkness, "remember when you asked me why I was still there? In the parking lot that night, I remember. I know the answer now." "What's the answer?" Daniel pulled her closer, feeling the solid warmth of her against him, the reassuring weight of a shared future full of possibilities they couldn't yet imagine. "I was still there because leaving isn't about going somewhere else. It's about becoming someone else. And I wasn't ready to become who I needed to be until I met you. And now I'm ready for anything." Outside their window, Chicago hummed with the energy of people pursuing their dreams, taking risks, choosing hope over fear. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Martinez was one of them, not just surviving, but thriving, not just existing, but truly alive. The story that had begun with a man afraid to move had. It's become a story about a man who couldn't wait to see where he'd go next. And that, Daniel thought as sleep began to claim him, was the best plot twist of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.